Now, the BBC presenter Chris Packham, he doesn't like to be out of the headlines too often, maybe even once an hour. He has said that Just Stop Oil do have the right to protest outside MPs' homes. This, despite the Prime Minister warning about mob rule. Yes, he was talking about Islamists, and the far right, but also people intimidating MPs in their own homes, including, indeed, himself, with Just Stop Oil protests at his own home in Yorkshire and, indeed, at Keir Starmer's home. Let's talk about this right now with the author of Green Tyranny, rather aptly. That's Rupert Darwell. Good afternoon to you, Rupert.
Good afternoon, Julia.
Thank you for joining us. Chris Packham has basically said we mustn't ban protests outside MPs' homes. He said, I think this is one of, he said, I think we need a portfolio of protests, basically, he says, because we need a radical flank, and Just Stop Oil are seen by many as that radical flank. He said this in an interview on Times Radio. He said, they are the people who, in some people's minds, go a step too far. And that might be, you know, standing outside an MP's house. But the fact is, this is the justification. They are motivated, as I am, he says, by a manifest fear for the health of our future. And that is on a foundation of understanding of very good science. We listen to the science tells us we have to act. So basically, because they feel very strongly about this issue and their concern is legitimate and real, they can basically just go and you know, terrify people out their homes. They may not be violent, they're not marauding inside someone's home, but hundreds of protesters gathering outside an MP's personal home where their family lives is, frankly, very intimidating and very threatening, isn't it? So is he right to think it's justified?
Well, it's clearly an incitement to intimidation. As you say, the justification is basically on the grounds of climate catastrophism. And where he's absolutely wrong is in saying that catastrophe is on the cards imminently, because it's simply not. If you look at the Working Group 1 report of the IPCC, of its contribution to the 6th Assessment Report, if you do a word search, you'll find the word catastrophe or catastrophism. I think it's mentioned 5 or 6 times in over 1,000 pages. And Julia, the first mention is climate catastrophism as a media narrative. And that's what it's about. Yeah. This is a media narrative. Yeah. This is an activist narrative. It is not grounded in science. And as has been demonstrated time and time again, there is no trend in extreme weather events. And the person to go on on that and Google it is Roger Pilker Jr., the climatologist at the University of Colorado in Boulder, who's done huge amounts of debunking the catastrophist narrative.
But an awful lot of very well regarded scientists in this field have been debunking a lot of this. More and more scientists speaking out. We're constantly told, how can you deny this? You're a climate denier. The world's going to... Again, difficult to keep up. Drown, boil, dry up. I can never remember which it is this week that is the fashionable one. Oh, on fire, that's the other one as well. But actually, we're told 97% of scientists agree on this. You're all wrong. But they don't, 97% of scientists don't agree on this. And that's completely, literally made up figure. There's no basis for that claim whatsoever. There's lots of debate on this, and particularly debate about how climate change is happening, what the cause of it is, what the outcome of it could be. But there's barely anyone who looks at the actual data who could possibly conclude that there is a catastrophe that would justify any sort of extreme action that we see from the Just Stop Oil people and others, justifying everything that they do. And yet, so many politicians pay lip service to it. They all sit there with Greta Thunberg. They don't want to criticise, even likes of David Attenborough, a man I used to have huge respect for, who talks an absolute load of nonsense on the climate change issue. And people like Chris Packham, who, as you say, is basically saying, yeah, it's OK, because you feel strongly about this issue, for you to go and basically go into someone else's property. I mean, we've got an image here, you know, Just Stop Oil people sitting on top of the Prime Minister's roof. I tell you what, you came and sat on my roof, I'd have something to say about it, and you wouldn't last very long. But this is intimidation of democratically elected MPs, and it shouldn't ever be acceptable, whatever the cause.
That's absolutely right. The other thing, Julia, in terms of there have been scientists, well-known climate scientists, who've made predictions of catastrophic events. One of the most noteworthy is James Hansen, the NASA scientist who set a lot of this off back in 1988, and he predicted Upper Manhattan would be underwater by now. I mean, complete bollocks, you know, absolute complete bollocks.
I probably should apologise for that language. Sorry, everybody, but I understand the sentiment.
But
but
you know, look at the record, look at the
Yeah.
record, look at the outturn against predictions, and the catastrophes have been, I mean, whether it's crop yields, you know, we're meant to be, climate change is meant to be devastating food supplies. And what's devastating food supplies is campaign against using methane to make nitrogen fertilizer. What's happened in the absolute scandal the Greens have caused, the devastation they've caused in Sri Lanka, which went green and then promptly ran out of food.
Yeah, crop yields have gone up huge, I mean, exponentially in the last sort of 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years. Again, at a time we weren't going to be able to feed our planet because of climate change. But you mentioned earlier some of those, you know, simple things like we're constantly told every time there is a forest fire, every time there is a hurricane that we see on our telly screens, every time there's a drought, every time there is a river that overflows and people's homes are flooded, whatever it is, it doesn't matter what it is always in part due, we're told, to climate change, because extreme weather events are going to, we're told, according to the modelling, are getting worse and are going to get worse. But as you say, the data, it's not a matter of opinion, it's not climate denial, it is a simple matter of fact with publicly available data that extreme weather events are not getting either the greater in frequency or greater in strength.
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line is we're being asked to believe that if it weren't for the Industrial Revolution and the accumulation of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the weather would be perfect and the average temperature would be 1.5 degrees colder, and somehow we'd all be better off. I mean, that's clearly nonsense.
Well, it's the Garden of Eden, isn't it? Don't you remember, back before the Industrial Age, everyone lived to 100 and had a wonderful time just walking in the meadows with gambolling lambs. That was how everyone lived then. They didn't die in childbirth or when they were 30 years old, and they didn't live with disease and goodness knows what, and they weren't freezing cold in winter. I mean, of course they weren't.
And what the activists won't tell you is that deaths from cold run around nine times greater than those from excessive heat. I mean, you won't hear Chris Packham ever talking about that.
No, exactly. And that's, by the way, that's true in Africa as well, which is extraordinary. But Chris Packham was also in the news at the weekend, and this is very worrying. And this is something that, again, Theresa May, thanks for everything you did, worst Prime Minister ever. Among the things she did, other than try and destroy Brexit, other things she did was bring in that, of course, net zero law that basically enshrined net zero by 2050. Unachievable, undesirable, never going to happen, but enshrined it in law. And that has meant that environmental campaigners like Chris Packham can keep making challenges in the High Court against any government policy which they believe goes against that the ability of the government to achieve that net zero policy. And at the weekend, he basically was granted permission for a judicial review at the High Court of the government's decision to reverse some of their green policies. I mean, obviously, I was on here welcoming this plan to basically delay the ban on the sale of new diesel and petrol cars from 2030 to 2035. There should be no ban, but 5 years later is better. Reducing the phase out of gas boilers as well, and scrapping required energy efficiency home upgrades. I thought these were all great moves. There was a little brief boost in the polls, but people thought it wasn't really going far enough, in my view. Chris Packham is saying, no, this goes against what is the law put in place by this Tory government that means you can't do that. I mean, reality is, we are going to be seeing more and more challenges as we approach 2030, 2050 even more so, which basically says that if you want to build anything, a nuclear power station, a railway line, a house, street lighting, a new airport runway, you want to do anything at all, it's going to be illegal because it doesn't help us get to net zero by 2050. Are we going to be allowed to build anything in this country?
Well, this is a really, really important point about the Climate Change Act and the legal commitment to meet net zero. The Climate Change Act imposes a duty, a legal duty on the government to pursue net zero. And the purpose of that is to put climate change policies beyond democratic policies, democratic politics. So it is inherently anti-democratic. And it takes decision-making away from elected politicians, and it gives it to NGO activists like Chris Packham and the courts. And of course, that is fundamentally anti-democratic. But as I just said, the whole point of the Climate Change Act is to put climate policy beyond democratic politics. So we can change change ministers, but actually nothing fundamentally changes
And we
because
didn't get a
they are
choice.
bound by
Yeah.
the Climate Change Act.
Exactly. In December 2019, people say, well, you know, you voted for a government if you voted Tory that would do this. We didn't get an option. There wasn't a major party that was offering to ditch net zero. And Boris Johnson, who at the time was the Tory leader, who said, well, this is all green nonsense. He basically, you know, his then fiancée or girlfriend, now wife, was basically fully signed up to all this mad green stuff. And basically, I'm assuming because the pressure over the breakfast table, toast and cereal was too much, signed up to it, and we're stuck with it. But we need to change that law. We need to turn that law over. That would be, if there's one good thing that this government could do before the next election, which they're almost bound to lose, is change that law, surely.
Well, in my view, what Sunak should do if he had I shouldn't say if he had a, but what he should do is come out with a policy, a sensible, popular policy, which the likes of Chris Packham could challenge in court, and then fight the next election on saying this is what we want to do. Yeah. The Climate Change Act and the courts are preventing us doing it. We want a mandate from you to de-legislate net zero, and that would work. And it's the same as Brexit. It's about taking back control.
Yeah.
Absolutely. This is about politicians and therefore voters taking back control.
Absolutely. Although it was the politicians who gave it away. There wasn't even a vote in Parliament. Thank you very much indeed. So good to talk to you. Rupert Darwell, author of Green Tyranny. Former Conservative advisor Charlie Rowley is back with me. Look, used to work for Michael Gove. He's fully signed up. On paper, this nonsense. Everyone in politics, pretty much, apart from Reform UK, as far as I can tell, and some very, very sensible figures in the Tory party, are signed up to this madness. It is madness. It's not achievable. It's not desirable. It won't save the planet. It will achieve absolutely nothing other than making us all poorer, which I don't think is what government should be elected to do. But it was a Tory government that did this.
So I think two things.
There you go. I almost feel sorry for you here. Come on.
I'm actually in favour of a target for net zero by 2050 because I think it's a challenge to innovators and it's a challenge to technology companies to make sure that we can try and reduce our emissions. But
No. Net zero doesn't reduce our emissions. No, because we can go to zero by never making anything in this country ever again. And we just import it from China, where everything we buy is going to be made in gas-powered or coal-powered factories. So we could have zero emissions on paper, but it wouldn't do anything to save the planet.
Well,
so why are you in favour of it, Charlie?
Because I think the air that we have in this country will always be different to the air in China, even though we'd be importing things.
But do you think it will save the planet?
I think no, probably not. But because you can't do anything like that unless you have China, unless you have America, unless you have India, big emitters doing the same thing. But I think for the UK, I think it's not a bad thing to strive. But
basically give away all our manufacturing and make people's lives poorer, people not being able to fly. There is no way you can hit net zero without us not being able to afford to put the heating on, not being able to own cars, not being able to fly abroad, not being able to eat the food we want to eat, and not being able to make anything in this country. You cannot hit it otherwise. We'll have blackouts every winter. You support that as a Conservative.
No, absolutely not.
That is, when you say you support net zero, that is what you support. Even the people pushing net zero, the official documents, that is what is required to hit it.
So I think net zero is a challenge to innovators, technology companies to try and have better technologies that we can do with all those things. But this is where I do agree. It should not come at the expense of
that's what the net zero legislation requires.
And that's why when
have a more expensive boiler, have a more expensive car.
And that shouldn't be right. And that's why when the facts change and the situation changes,
facts haven't changed. The facts always said this was a disaster.
But when the economy is taking a bit of a turn and you don't want to pass that cost on to hardworking
people
and households...
It doesn't matter if the economy is in good nick or not. You still shouldn't be supporting a policy that makes people poorer and colder.
But I think, which is why I don't think you should have those measures in place. So I think you can come to net zero, you can become more energy efficient, we can become more environmentally friendly in the long term.
You can't reach net zero without massively curtailing people's wealth and people's freedom. You cannot do it. It is impossible.
And it is wrong at this moment in time to make sure that
it's always wrong to do that. Charlie,
the only other reason...
Can we just have a little young people today moment, everybody?
But this is the only... And that is exactly the next point, because if you're the Tory party today, you're losing support from people under the age of, I think it's about 40 now. So if you're having a policy that is attracting...
By making them even poorer? Brilliant.
There's a lot of young people out there that would support green policies that don't support the crack pottery like Just Stop Oil.
No one's saying would support any green policies that made themselves and their families poorer, which is what all all net zero policies do. Right, we're going to have to leave it there. You're in the wrong. End of. I'm telling you, if I gave you a little questionnaire, gave you some facts and figures on this, like every single politician or advisor I ask about this, you don't know the actual facts of what this is required. It's contained in documents. It's not what people like me think. It's what the actual documents say would be necessary to hit net zero. You can't hit net zero without making us poorer.
Well, I think we can achieve net zero. I really do. But
you can think as much as you want.
But I don't think it should come at the expense of. I agree with you entirely. I don't think it should come at the expense of, changing your boiler or having these heat pumps or anything that's going to.
Then you're not going to achieve net zero. So drop the policy, right, Charlie? I'm going to educate him in the break. Yeah.